Thank you to Sweetwater for sponsoring this video and supporting my channel. There are a bunch of MIDI controllers out there, but today I wanted to talk to you specifically about my new favorite for the home studio, the Atom SQ. Hey there, I'm Ivan Calderon and welcome back to another video. So around this time last year, I got my hands on the original Atom by PreSonus, and I even made a video about it, which you can watch right here. At that time, I stated how it was my favorite beat pad and not only one of the easiest ways to make beats, but also to control Studio One. Well, here we are about a year later, and in front of me I have PreSonus's latest addition to the Atom family, and quite honestly, my new favorite MIDI controller, the Atom SQ. So then today I want to do a deep dive into what this thing is, how to use it, why I like it, and maybe why you might like it too. Much like with last year's video, this one will be divided up into different parts, which will include form factor, functionality, and then my final thoughts at the end. Unlike last year's video, this one will not have a demo included, and that's simply because that would make this video way too long since there is already a lot to cover. No need to worry though, I already have a video out that walks you through how to make a beat using the Atom SQ, and you can watch that here. The SQ is also now my main controller, so I'll be putting out more videos in the future showing you how I use it in my own personal workflow. So you're still getting the demos, but just in more separate dedicated videos, which in my opinion is a better way to showcase the abilities of the SQ without it becoming too overwhelming. Before we get started though, I do want to give a huge shout out to the sponsor of this video, Sweetwater. Sweetwater is the largest online retailer for musical instruments and pro audio equipment in the United States, and the place where I've gotten most of my gear in the past few years, which is why I'm super pumped to be partnering with them for this video. Not only are they a one-stop shop for all of your studio needs, but their customer service is top tier. And no lie, I've had the same sales rep for like the past 5 years, and he always calls after I buy something just to make sure that everything is okay. Not only that, but they also send candy with every order. Thank you to Sweetwater for sponsoring this video, and without further ado, let's jump right in. So to get it out the way, the Atom SQ retails for $250, and in the box you will get the unit itself, a USB cable that will not only power the device but also connect it to your computer, and a copy of Studio One Artist and Ableton Live Lite. Okay, jumping into the form factor, I gotta be honest with you, when I first saw this thing, I really wanted to hate it because it was so different than what I was used to using. Depending on how old you are, this unit either resembles an old school drum machine like a TR-808, or a step sequencer similar to what you might see in FL Studio. Either way, this was nothing like what I was used to creating with. The unit is roughly 1x14x7 and weighs about 2 pounds, and if you put it next to the original Atom, you can see how it compares in size. We're gonna go over what all of these buttons do in a minute, but for now, let's do a quick overview. Starting on the top left, we have the multifunction bank buttons labeled A through H, and below that, we have your basic transport controls, which include stop, play, record, and the metronome. Both the bank buttons and the transport buttons have secondary functions that can be triggered with the shift button, all of which I'll be talking about a little bit later. Below that, we have the pressure sensitive up and down pitch control buttons here that can be programmed through the unit's menu. In the top middle, we have the 8 programmable rotary encoders that also have secondary global functions accessible with the shift key. Below that, we have the multifunction touch strip that can be programmed to different expressive controls through the unit's menu. And then of course, at the very bottom, we have the standout feature of this unit, which are its 32 RGB polyphonic pressure and velocity sensitive pads placed in a staggered TR layout. If you move over to the right of the unit, we have the main context sensitive screen that changes depending on the use and application. To the left of that screen here, we have the mode buttons that include song, instrument, editor, and user. On the top and bottom of the screen, we have additional buttons that allow you to select or activate different functions within a mode. And then over to the right here, we have the page navigation buttons to switch between different pages within a mode. Above that, we also have a separate encoder for this menu screen to further adjust parameters. Finally, below all of this, we have the Studio One navigation buttons with your standard up, down, left and right controls. And then of course, finally to the right, we have that shift button that I was talking about to activate all of those secondary functions on some of the other buttons that I mentioned. All right, now that you're a little bit more familiar with the SQ, let's talk more about what this thing can do. The unit is plug and play and it integrates automatically with Studio One. The unit also has a tight integration with Ableton, so you can theoretically start to use this thing out of the box with the provided software. Now, the SQ is extensive, so I'll walk you through it bit by bit, but let's start off with the basic transport and navigation controls. As you might already know, the Atom units are not just MIDI controllers, but they can also fully operate and control Studio One. On the top left of the unit, you're gonna have your basic transport controls that will allow you to play, stop, go to the beginning of the song if you press the stop button twice, record, and then turn the metronome on or off. These buttons also have secondary functions as well, so if you hold down the shift key, the stop button becomes undo, the play button becomes your loop on and off, your record button becomes your save, and then the metronome button becomes your record pre-count on and off. If we shift over to the right of the unit, we have the navigation controls, which can be used to navigate through different tracks in the arranger view, the channels in the mixer, and even through the folders in the browser, with the left and right being used to go in and out of folders. Moving back to the center of the unit, we have the 8 rotary knobs that I mentioned earlier. By default, they are blank, but you can program them to control a bunch of different parameters. To do that, you want to hop over to the external devices window, and while there are plenty of ways to get there, the easiest one is to go to the top leftmost box in Studio One, so right here, drop this arrow down, and then go over to the unit you want to customize. In our case, that would be the Atom SQ. Once here, move a knob that you want to assign, so let me just do knob number 1. Go over to the parameter that you want to link, so let's go over to this volume fader, right-click, and then hit Assign to that knob. One thing you might notice here is that although you only have 8 knobs on your SQ, you do have 8 pages in the software to assign different things to, so in reality you have 64 knobs that you can program and go crazy with. Now that was cool, but my favorite feature with these knobs are their secondary global functions. If you press the shift key, each of these knobs will now do a specific task in Studio One that relates to your workflow. So for example, knob number 1 will move the loop selection around. Knob number 2 will scroll vertically. Knob number 3 will set the start point of your loop. Knob number 4 will set the grid's quantize value. Knob number 5 will move the playback head. Knob number 6 will zoom horizontally. Knob number 7 will set the endpoint of your loop. And finally, knob number 8 will allow you to nudge notes in the piano roll. While we're here, I also want to point out that the bank buttons also have secondary functions. As a matter of fact, if you press and hold the shift key, the screen on the Atom will actually tell you what these buttons do. So if we take a look, the A button here will close or show all windows. The B button will select all. The C button will copy. The D button will duplicate. The E button will redo. The F button will activate the retrospective record feature, the G button will paste, and then the H button will delete. We're gonna talk about the touch strip and the main menu screen here in a minute, but for now, let's talk about the main standout feature, which is the pads. Now, as soon as you plug in the SQ, the pads will by default turn a white color, but when you activate it on an instrument track, they will turn white, gray, and the color of whatever you have your track set to. Now, the benefit of a staggered pad layout is that they can easily resemble piano keys, so much like a piano, the bottom pads will be the white keys and the top will be the black. Going back to the colors, any gray pads are not playable, any white keys are playable, but again, with the bottom being the white and the top being the black. And then any colored keys here are going to be the root note of your scale, more on that in a little bit, but for me in this case, that would be a C. As mentioned before, these pads are polyphonic and pressure sensitive, so you do have the ability to play expressive chords. If you ever want to switch octaves, all you have to do is go back to the bank buttons on the top left. By default, it will be set to D, but you can change that to go up or down. If you notice, the A button is always orange here, and that's because rather it being used for changing octaves, it is actually used as a sustain pedal. So if you take a look here, that's without sustain, and if I hold down the A button, if you ever want to pitch your notes or chords, all you have to do is play some pads, and then use these 2 buttons here on the far left, the plus and minus buttons, to go up or down. Alternatively, if you want to mess with the modulation of your performance, then you can use the touch strip to handle that. So that's the pads whenever you use them with an instrument track, but now let's see how they behave with drums. If you go over to Impact XT, which is Studio One's native drum sampler, then the pads will now turn white unless you have your pads on Impact XT set to a specific color. As you can see on mine, I have a combination of white, of course, but then also orange, green, and blue to match what I have on my Impact XT. Now, although you do get smaller pads on the SQ, they compensate by giving you more, which can actually be useful in scenarios where you might want to access multiple drum kits at once. Instead of only having one bank of 16 drum sounds available, the SQ allows you to have 2 banks at all times, 16 at the bottom and then 16 at the top. If we take a look again at the bank buttons on the top left here, you'll see that buttons A and B have been activated by default. And again, that's because the SQ can show you 2 banks of pads at once. So here it's showing me bank A at the bottom and bank B at the top. If I want to go over to the next set of banks, I can just press the C button and now it'll show me bank C and D. Again, this is extremely useful if you're someone who maybe produces different genres of music and you want to be able to have multiple kits ready to go. Now, the last main way to use these pads, as far as I'm concerned, is with patterns. If you're unfamiliar, a pattern in Studio One is basically a step sequencer part, much like you would see in FL Studio. You don't need an SQ to program parts into Studio One, but because it already has that step sequencer layout, it makes it really easy to program them with the unit. Now, you can use patterns with an instrument track, but personally, I think they work a lot better with drums. I'll show you how to insert a pattern part with the SQ itself a little bit later, but for now, if you want to do it within Studio One, go up to the menu, go to Event, and Insert Pattern. To sync this part with your SQ, simply hit the Editor button on the top right here, and you'll see that your pads will now turn white and red. The top pads will be white, and these are your actual drum samples that you can select and audition. On the bottom, we're gonna have the red keys, and these are your actual steps in the sequencer that you can program. So the whole process then would be to first select a drum sample. So let me just select a hi-hat here. Then on the bottom, go ahead and actually program your actual steps. Then hit play. Now, this specific pad application has its own window in the menu here that you can only access when in this mode. So let's go ahead and take a look and see what it has. If you head over to the menu window on the top right here, you'll see a couple of options. Now, the first page here is dedicated to variation. So from here, you can add a new variation, duplicate a variation, toggle through different variations, change the steps, change the resolution, and even change the swing. The second page here is dedicated to the lane, so here you can do things such as change the layout from drums to melodic, set a step on every 4th position, shift any notes here placed in the sequencer, and finally, of course, you could also just clear the entire lane. Finally, the last page here is set to control specific notes or steps you have placed. To use it, first select a note or step, and then from here you can change the velocity, you can change the repeat, and I'm only using my mouse here to show you on screen. You can change the delay and even the probability. All right, so we've gone through a lot, but we're not done yet. I said this thing was extensive and I meant it. Now, the last thing we gotta go over is the different modes and all of their options. As mentioned before, the Atom has a deep integration with Studio One, so if you like the original Atom for that reason, then you're going to love this even more because it has a lot more functionality. If we head over to the top right of the unit here, we see 4 main mode buttons: the song, instrument, editor, and user. If we start with the song mode here, you'll see that the screen shows me page 1, which deals with transport controls. Here we have the option to set the tempo, loop a selection, zoom to loop, add a marker. So I'm gonna use here knob number 5 to go over here, add a marker, and maybe I'll add another one, maybe like over here. Of course, we could also shift through the different markers. And finally, you could also engage the input quantize. Now, the way you control some of these parameters will vary because some will just require you to press the button directly above or below it, like the input quantize, and then others will require you to first select it, like with the tempo, and then use the knob here on the right to adjust it. If you go over to page number 2 of this mode here, we have some console controls, which include opening and closing the console or mixer, opening and closing the inspector window, changing the volume of any track. So if you look at my screen here, I'm changing the volume of my Nexus 3 track. And of course, soloing, muting, and record enabling a track. Moving on to page number 3, we have the arranger controls. Here we have the ability to toggle the arranger window, duplicate the currently selected event, or if I come in here and I add a section, I can duplicate that as well. Delete a currently selected section. Add a new section from the currently selected events. So if I do this, select these, then hit add from selection, it adds a new section. Zoom in and out horizontally. And of course, the ability to shift through different arranger sections. Next up on page 4, we have the effect controls. Here we can open the effects browser, the channel editor, switch between different effects or devices when the channel editor is in focus, load an effect. So from here, I can go down and maybe add this OTT. And of course, you do have the ability to open or close different folders in the effects browser. So that was the song mode. Let's move on now to the instrument mode. Now the instrument mode is one of my favorites, and here in page 1, we have the ability to open or close the instrument browser, show or hide any currently selected instrument window. So let's say, for example, that I'm working with a Nexus here, and I want to get rid of this window. All I have to do is press this button to make it go away, or press it to make it come back. Show or hide the note effects editor, load a VST, and then of course I also have the ability to open and close different folders. Moving on to page number 2, this one houses the track controls, and here we can add some of Studio One's native note effects, including the quarter and the ARP. Here we can also merge audio or MIDI events, so if I select all of these here, I can press this button and merge them together. On the bottom here, you have the option to add a pattern like I was mentioning earlier. So you press that and you get a pattern event. Next to that, you also have the ability to add a regular part, which is basically just a MIDI event. And finally, if you press this last button here titled length, you can adjust the length of any selected event. Moving on, page number 4 gives us some performance control. So here we can switch the control of the strip wheel from modulation to pitch bend, control link, expression, breath, repeater, which is actually really handy for programming hi-hat rolls. And finally, you could also use a strip wheel to control channel volume and channel panning. Now, real quick, to use the repeater, all you have to do is first select it here on the strip wheel, then go over 2 buttons to the right and activate the note repeat. Then go over to a drum track. So here I have my impact ready to go. Select your sample to play. So I'm gonna do a hi-hat. And then from here, you can use the strip wheel sections to play different values. So now, going back one here, this second button allows you to reprogram the pitch bend buttons from controlling pitch to controlling breath modulation. Shifting over to the bottom row, we have the rate button, which allows you to change the note value of the note repeat with this encoder here, if that's a way that you like to work. A gate, which decreases or increases the note repeat length. And then, of course, finally, a pressure button, which enables or disables the ability to control note repeat velocity with more or less pressure. The very last page here is for the pads, and this one's my favorite because here we can change their layout from keyboard, so a traditional piano layout, to continuous, basically meaning that the top row is just a continuation from the bottom, so to scale only, which is similar to continuous, but now these notes are locked into a specific scale. The next button over is the scale button, and here's where you get to pick what scale you want to work in, and there is a bunch. So you have, chromatic, major, melodic minor, harmonic minor, natural minor, and a bunch more to choose from. The last button here on the top is the root button, and this one will allow you to set the root note or key. At the bottom of this page, we have the ability to change the octave, so if you don't want to do it through the bank buttons, you could do it through here with this encoder. The range, which will shift the notes up and down. And then, of course, the full velocity button, which will allow you to always trigger a fixed velocity every time that you press the pads. Moving on to the editor mode, this one is interesting because it's dynamic, meaning that it changes depending on what you are doing. Now, as far as I could tell, it really only has 3 main views, which are with patterns, instruments, and then audio. I've shown you the patterns earlier, so let's take a look at the other 2, starting with the audio. Now, the first thing you'll notice when pressing this button is that the actual editor in Studio One will pop up. When you load this into an audio track, you'll notice that we get specific options here in the screen. Starting from the top, we have the ability to send that sample, that audio piece, to impact. Play from selected, which basically moves the playhead to the beginning of an event while the transport is stopped or playing. Go to event, which basically moves the playhead to the beginning of an event if the transport is stopped. On the bottom, we have create crossfades, switch between different transients if you have them, and then of course split the event at the playhead's position. On the second page here, we have a couple of different options, including send to sample 1, reversing the audio, changing the event's volume, not to be confused with the channel's volume, removing crossfades, merging events, and then splitting at the grid, which again is based on the value of whatever you have set. Switching over to an instrument track now, you'll see that the window will now change to a couple of different options. Now these include the ability to quantize, toggle the snap on and off, change the grid's value. And then at the bottom here, you have a couple of different options for your composition. So here I have a chord. Now, once I select it, I can press this first button to transpose it up or down. I can press a second button to nudge it back and forth. And then of course, that last button will allow me to adjust the velocity. The very last page here allows you to humanize time, so I can press that button to make it sound a little bit more realistic. I can restore the timing if I ever want to go back to whatever I had it set before. I can split at grid, which again will split it based on your value that you have set. I can extend that part to the end of my event. I can repeat that part to the end of my event. And then of course, I can always explode my pitches to different tracks. Finally, the last mode here is the user mode. And now this one I won't go into detail because although there are some preset parameters and commands, you can customize these pages and buttons to do basically whatever you want within Studio One. Now this mode here is probably the best way to make Studio One specific to you and to speed up your workflow. Now what I will show you though is how to change those parameters, and to do that you want to go back to the external devices window that I showed you from before. To do that, again, go to this little area here, drop this menu down, and then select Atom SQ. Now once here, instead of using these knobs, you want to head over to the right area here, and this is where you're going to program different commands. Once here, simply hover over the button that you want to change, right click to either unassign or assign a different command. Now, much like with the knobs here, this is just page one. You can shift through a bunch of different pages, 8 to be exact, and you can pretty much customize this to whatever you want it to be. Okay, so final thoughts. Now, I said this in my minimal beat making setup video, and I'll say it again here. The Atom SQ at the moment is my favorite MIDI controller for the home studio. Now, it's not really because it does anything crazy. A lot of what it could do, I could do already before, but what makes it special for me is that it can take care of all my production workflows in one single unit. Not only can I play drums if I want to, but I could also program chords, play melodies, and even control Studio One. Now, this doesn't mean that I'm never going to use a regular keyboard again. I have one back there, you can see it. But the magic in this for me is being able to create right away with one single unit. Now, with that being said, I do have 2 suggestions and 1 main concern. Suggestion number 1 is to allow for these 8 knobs up here to control channel volumes by default. As I showed earlier, these knobs here have a secondary global function to help with workflow, but by default, they are blank. You can program these to different parameters, but it would be super cool if these by default would be able to control volume. Maybe make it smart too, so like out the gate, have them control channels 1 through 8, and then as soon as I touch channel 9, they now control 9 through 16 and so on and so forth. If not by default, then at least make it a feature that we can access within like the song mode, for example, because that would make volume balancing in a mix a lot easier for someone who may not need a fader port. Suggestion number 2 is to allow for this encoder here on the far right to allow me to scroll through different channels and tracks. Now I understand currently it has a dynamic workflow, so it'll change depending on what you're doing. So this might need some tweaking here and there to make it happen, I don't know. But sometimes you don't want to be pressing these buttons like 30 times just to get to a track at the bottom of your session. Having a knob here that can do it much quicker would be so much better. Now finally, the biggest concern that I have with the SQ is that its strength is also its biggest weakness. You can do pretty much anything you want to do with this little thing here, but because it's so compact, that means that some things will have to be stored in submenus and subfolders and in different pages, and when efficiency is the name of the game, sometimes it might be easier or faster to just access that command in a different way. Additionally, because it has so many different features, you're gonna have to spend some time learning and memorizing the different locations of your favorite commands. Of course, you always have the user menu here that you can use to your advantage, but that still leaves you with flipping through different pages back and forth. Personally, for me, the value of the SQ is in the performance department because, as I mentioned before, this allows me to produce with ease. The double pad tiers here make drum sample access a breeze, and then with the scale feature, this makes playing chords and melodies super easy. Again, this doesn't mean that I'm not using a regular keyboard. Sometimes you do need regular keys, but to get an idea out quickly, this thing is golden. When controlling Studio One, that's when things get tricky, specifically for me, because I already have a system set in place. There are a few controls that I find handy, like the transport controls, of course, and then the secondary functions here on these knobs, but for the most part, I already have my favorite commands linked to either my physical typing keyboard, my multifunction mouse, or my Stream Deck. What that basically means is that 90% of the time as I'm producing, I don't have to take my hands off of these things here, which for me is a huge positive. Of course, everyone's workflow is different, so at the end of the day though, and ultimately, I am glad that the SQ gives you so much functionality, because if you want a one-stop shop, then this is it. As mentioned before though, just be prepared to spend some time learning it. But there you have it, that is the Atom SQ by PreSonus. As mentioned in the beginning of the video, I will be putting out more Atom SQ videos moving forward, and there you'll be able to see different workflows and how I'm using it, so look out for those. Now though, I wanna hear from you. What do you think of the Atom SQ? Do you hate it? Do you love it? If you don't have one, would you consider getting one? And if you already have the regular Atom, do you think this is worth the upgrade? Let me know in a comment down below. But that's it for me. Thank you so much for watching. I'll be leaving a link to the Atom SQ down below in the description in case you want to pick it up. Thank you so much to Sweetwater for sponsoring this video. And as always, like this video if you liked it, subscribe if you're not already, but I'll see you on the next one.